the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. What's the worst thing you can imagine about your child's first day of school? I first came across this headline in an article by my colleague Shree Paradkar in The Star. It read, "Someone put a drawing of a noose in her daughter's backpack. Then things got worse." She was describing a 13-year-old's first day of school. And let me repeat, then things got worse. This young girl's mom is Natasha Shakespeare, whose fight against anti-Black racism in schools has taken her through 2 school districts, led her to found an advocacy group called Parents Against Racism, and file a lawsuit against Simcoe County District School Board, alleging it failed to address the racism and bullying her daughter faced there. And yet, in another district, another school, the Forest Hill Public School, there is no fresh start for this family. Their daughter, whom we will not name to protect her privacy, did not stand a chance.
It started on the first day of school. On our car ride home, she actually shared with me that she had found a hand-drawn picture of a noose in her backpack. And that was our intro to the new school. It took me and her and us as a family 3 days to process that incident, to figure out what to do about it. And as the week continued, she experienced other things. So, kids making fun of her race, making comments around all lives matter. She heard the N-word. So all of these things were happening as we were still trying to process the first day of school. The Friday, that first week of school, I had called the principal to let her know about what had been happening. And then it just continued. So week by week, it consistently got worse and worse and worse. As the weeks went by, there continued to be incidents of the N-word. There was an incident where a student had put it in a text message. That was something the principal did find out about and attempted to handle that situation. And then it continued to escalate, where I got a call from the principal one day explaining to me that there was a cyber conversation that happened. So cyberbullying, I guess they defined it as, that a parent had discovered on their cell phone amongst a group of boys. It was pretty horrific and vile, and so violent that the principal actually did call the police. There were other notes that followed. She actually brought one home in October. So she had been sharing, these are things that are happening. There have been lots of notes, but she kept hiding them and throwing them out because she was so upset, embarrassed, shocked. She didn't know what to do.
Natasha says what began with a horrific image and racial slurs escalated to death and rape threats, and finally a physical attack. Each day, Natasha and her husband debate whether or not to send their daughter to school at all. Those are the kinds of conversations this family is forced to have.
It consumes you, right? It takes everything out of you to the point where even last night, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth, toothbrush in hand, but I forgot while I was there, right? It just takes all your energy. I have headaches to the point where I can't have my eyes open. After a meeting with the school board, I know that I'm done for the day. I'm going to have to nap. It absolutely consumes you and drains everything that you have.
And this is not something a 13-year-old should be getting used to. And yet,
there was an incident at her previous school where her and her friends were called the N-word. And that wasn't the first time that her friends or her were called the N-word. That was something that unfortunately was a very regular occurrence, whether it was directed to them, whether, again, it was in a text or a TikTok song or being asked for the N-word pass. That was something that happened on a very regular basis. But I guess last November, when her and her friends were called the N-word, when she came home and told me about it, she had said, "Well, Mom, who cares? They're not going to do anything about it anyways. They never do." And it was something just clicked. At this point, my child has learned their voice doesn't matter. They don't matter. And the system is not for them. And I just was I can't stand for that. I can't have that be, because that's not how it should be.
Her experiences represent an explosion of anti-Blackness in schools across Ontario, often intersecting with other forms of hate, including anti-Semitism. The Star's race and gender columnist Shree Paradkar joins me now to help us understand what's going on, what are the implications, and what, if anything, is being done to stop this. Hi, Shree. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Saba. Thanks for having me.
Shree, first of all, give me a picture. What's happening across the education system here? It seems like year after year, we hear about these anti-Black racism incidents. And has the problem only been getting worse? And how bad is it right now?
So, yeah, that's a good overview question. It's really important for me to say that anti Black racism has always been pervasive in Ontario school system, in various provincial school systems. And speaking of Ontario, when our education system was being created, it was created with a progressive education system for white European children on the one hand, then a brutal residential school system and other school systems for Indigenous students, and then a segregated school system for Black students. There was also another school for people with disabilities. So it was architecturally really heinous to begin with. And so when we're talking about a system which begins with the premise that Black people are inferior, that they need to be trained differently, that they need to be contained and controlled and taught even how to be clean and some of those basic things that other humans don't require. When that is the basic attitude that created this system, when segregation ended in Ontario in 1965, all it did was it got about desegregation. It did not bring about integration because there was no real attempt to change how that curriculum that was created for white children was changed. There was no real attempt to change it to cater to now including Black children. And there was no change in how teachers viewed Black children, for instance. So they have historically, and even since so-called integration, they have kept being treated as the other. That is the system that we inherit today. And that is not a new system. So this is something that has been studied, that has been the subject of multiple reports. There is no surprise at all. So the one change that you asked about, what is the problem getting worse, is in what we are seeing today is the rise of overt white supremacy, but also the rise of resistance. That is not to say that Black parents have not always resisted the school system. Natasha Henry, who's a historian, said that way back in the 1840s, Black parents were advocating against segregated school systems. But the media has been gatekeepers to this sort of resistance. And now there are multiple ways for people to come forward. So now you have both the backlash to that resistance, the rise of white supremacy, the resistance, and the backlash to that resistance. So that is what is causing what I see as an explosion of anti-Black racism around us.
Yes, and like you said, that's why we're hearing of a lot of these incidents. A lot of disturbing incidents have been coming to light just in the past few weeks or so, right?
That's true. And Charlene Grant, who's a co-founder of the Parents of Black Children, was saying that it's not only where in the past you would get complaints that were a subtler form of anti-Black racism, which is, around streaming issues, suspensions, not so subtle, but, gifted programs, what kind of designations you get. Right now, the problems are all back to basics. Racial slurs, blackface. You had both of that happening at a Toronto school in Parkdale where a teacher turned up in blackface for Halloween. And I understand that there's another teacher being investigated for using racial slurs. After our story was published in the Star, there were so many people who came forward to talk about their experiences with racial slurs. And, you have to pick your battles. And at some point, there are a lot of people who say, okay, then this is not a battle I'll fight something else. But thankfully, there are also a lot of people who say, well, I'm not going to take this. And they come forward.
Like Natasha, for instance, and I was speaking to her, and I read about other incidents in your piece about kids bullying other kids. And it boggled my mind that young school children are doing this kind of discrimination. So who do we blame? The school, the parents, the system? And I just quickly want to know if you think there's a connection, because we're talking about stories of teachers coming out in blackface. So is there any trickle-down effect here where the teachers themselves seem to be doing this kind of stuff?
I think if we have to assign responsibility rather than blame, it's all of the above. So the individual teachers who act like that, yes. The individual teachers who don't hold to account students who might say, let's say, the N-word, the individual teachers who have not fostered a safe space for Black students to always know that they can go to that teacher and be safe, individual parents who might be very loose with the language at home, but also, apart from all of this, also, I think the rise in meme culture. Because memes are a very effective way of obfuscating hate in the guise of humor, in the guise of irony. And it makes people feel clever. It's so easily accessible. It's just one image, one quick video, and it's accessible to children. And half the time, parents don't even know what the children are watching because it's just on your social media feed and it's just coming and going, coming and going. 1 or 2 clicks away, and you're in this world of hate culture. So, unless you have a home in which you are actively speaking about racism and about hate, and if you're in a home where it's casual and a lot more, you yourself might have biased ideas that you express without any repercussions, then yeah, a child there is going to think this is all part of what is normal, which is why we are seeing little children also turning to anti Semitic slurs. Anti-Black slurs, but also anti-Semitic slurs, because that is what you see in white supremacist meme culture.
So it's being reflected with the children. You also speak in your piece about the experience of John, another parent from Scarborough, and you talk a little bit about how he seemed to be dealing with the subtle duality of how school authorities deal with racially charged incidents, and then what happens when it finally ends up with the child who's being victimized lashing out or trying to defend themselves. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Does it show that there's some teachers might be missing the nuance and the cultural context of when a Black child faces something like this?
Yeah, I think what teachers are missing in that case is a little bit of introspection. So, in the case of John, who is fairly new immigrant to Canada, and it takes a lot of courage. He's only been here for 3 years. So, it takes a lot of courage for a new immigrant to say, hey, don't do this to my child. My child is fully a human. He came out, he's been protesting, he's been holding rallies. And then they had this one rally that I went to. And John has a 9-year-old in the Toronto District School Board. And he's been bullied. So one day, for instance, another child grabbed his mask and ran, grabbed John's son's mask and ran. So John's son ran behind him and grabbed the mask back. In the process of grabbing, the other child's mask fell off. And this went up to the teacher, and the teacher sent an email to both the parents saying both the children have been told, and basically she assigned responsibility to both, which may be okay, except that when John's child was the one being even physically beaten with a stick, he was getting no such email to even tell him that something like this is happening. So it seems like when the child is a victim, there's not enough sympathy, or it's not even seen as something worth telling parents about. And that's something that I found was common and remains common among so many parents who come forward, is that the teacher or the principal does not call them to tell them what has happened. They happen to find out, and they are the ones that go to teachers, and they are the ones that go to the school. So that initiative saying that, there is something wrong, in the case of Natasha, that, hey, there was a slur used today and we need to tell you, is not seen as a big enough issue that the parent should be involved in.
We'll be right back.
Shree, how much difference would better representation in the teaching community make?
Absolutely all the difference, because right now, most teachers are white women, which is fine, except that what anti-racism does is it's asking women who have no experience of racism to understand and feel its slash, and then to treat children accordingly. They have no experiential understanding of racism. They might have a theoretical and empathy-based one. But when you get a teacher, and it's not enough that it just be a teacher who is racialized, it needs to be a person with an analysis of anti-oppression. Because I have heard a South Asian teacher in a primary school say that I don't want to go out in the sun because it'll make me dark, right? I have heard a white school teacher give an assignment to the students where they're supposed to draw children playing in the snow, and the teacher's super helpful and she's saying, hey, and just color in their red cheeks. Right? Now, are they aware of how they are linking desirability and normalcy to skin tone? So there's so many levels of that introspection. So that teacher of color is of no use if she's going to go to school and say, I don't want to be dark. You need somebody who understands anti-oppression, who has that analysis. And studies do show that when you have a teacher that is not only somebody who will establish a good relationship with the child, but will also show the child that she recognizes their worth, that makes the difference between success and failure. The child needs to know that the teacher is their advocate and not an enemy. And that is something that's not happening with Black children, and also not with Indigenous children, and also not with a lot of other racialized children from poor backgrounds.
And what are the negative impacts of that on Black and other racialized students? Is this something that eventually plays a role in the structural problems we might see later on?
It does, because it creates this phenomenon called push out, where There's a lawyer in the story that I wrote, Daryl Singer, who says he's handling dozens of these cases at any given time, dozens of anti-Black racism cases. And he mentioned something that, Black parents have told me over the years, which is that their child faces racist bullying. The issues brought up, the teachers and the staff either do nothing or they do little about it, and the problem is not addressed. And then the child faces this, finally the child lashes out. This could even be a year or two of just taking this nonsense, but it's when the child lashes out that the school board's zero tolerance policy sort of kicks in and takes shape. So what then happens is then you have suspension, because now you have proof that this child did something wrong, but there is no application of historical data on why that child acted the way they did. Sometimes if you have a child who suffered intergenerational trauma and they're coming from a place of difficulty at home, that can also cause some kind of behavioral issues. And instead of looking at behavioral issues as deficit on part of the child, if you're able to understand the context and then allow the child to reach for their potential rather than constantly penalize them, you're going to have a different outcome. But what happens instead? The child gets suspended, the child gets expelled. Black and Indigenous children are highly represented in both of those data. And then it creates all the ingredients for a push out from school, because there is no point being in school because you're so alienated in school. And the other problem, this is something I had never seen until I came to Canada, is schools calling police to discipline children. And how is that even possible? How is it possible that you have a 11, 12, 13-year-old child misbehaving and you call the police? So you directly create a school to prison pipeline. And this is not new to Canada. This is not new to Toronto. There was a Roots of Violence report in the 90s that directly linked suspensions and expulsions to this school to prison pipeline. So when we're talking about school to prison, we're talking about students who don't have the opportunity for an education. They drop out. Now you don't have opportunities for jobs. As it is, you face racism for your identity on top of it. Now you don't have opportunities for housing. So how are you going to earn? You turn to the one place that is open to you, which is now called crime. When it was cannabis, it was called crime. Today, it's not a crime. But all of those people who were criminalized in that process have not been compensated or even given an opportunity to turn their knowledge into a real business. So it is at so many levels that discrimination that begins from school age continues into a lifetime, that it creates conditions that are untenable for Black people to survive.
It's all interconnected, basically. So this is a really big question, and I know there cannot be one answer to this, but if you could come up with one or two suggestions, what have been some of the solutions that have been proposed by anti-racism and Black advocates that could help improve things? Maybe even one thing that could help improve.
So if I think of what would somebody like a Carl James, who is a giant in Ontario education and Canadian education, he's the chair of the Faculty of Education at York University. And what would Carl James talk about? And he talks about continuously having cultural awareness in the curriculum. He talks about a curriculum which is not just about what is the written word and the spoken word, but he's also talked about having the teachers be in the communities that the children come from. And so if the teacher is to read in the news that, say, TTC's budget has been slashed, how does that impact your student's life? Because they're not all children being dropped off by car by their parents. What are their other responsibilities at home? Do they have to drop off another sibling? What does the implication of not having a bus there mean? What would be the implication of COVID, for instance? And if you come from a completely different neighborhood than your student does, you have no sense of identification at all. So mixing that curriculum with the child's culture and identity, you walk into a classroom, I should be able to tell at a glance that there are people from multiple cultures in this class. There are some schools in Toronto that do this beautifully. There are some schools, many schools that absolutely do not. So how are you showing that child that you value their culture? How are you allowing them to value their own language? There are still children who go to school and they tell their parents they don't want to speak their mother tongue because it makes them feel ashamed. What are you doing at school to show that you value the language they have? Not just by saying, hey, write an essay on the festival, but actually showing it in the classroom through the artwork, through what you are encouraging them to be. So these are some of the very, very small things, but there are multiple solutions out there. And I think what frustrates me the most about this is solutions exist. The solutions are out there. The data exists. Everything is there, but we're not changing. So that's when we need to ask, why not?
That's what we need to think about. Just really quickly, Shree, are there any resources that you came across while reporting on this that might be helpful for any parents who are listening and who might be facing a similar situation?
I don't want to overflood parents of Black children, but there are parent coalition groups out there. Because the system is not doing enough, parents are. At least, they would start with knowing what are their rights. They could start with knowing that, for instance, they can demand to see their children's end of year reports and have them deleted and erased before they go to the next school, and they'll know what their rights are. So I would say look for parent coalitions in your neighborhood, go to Facebook groups, look for like-minded people, find groups, and then see if you can do it together, because going alone can be really isolating.
Thank you so much, Shree, for your time and for this very thoughtful conversation.
Thank you for having me, Sabah.
I was speaking to the Star's race and gender columnist, Shree Paradkar. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabah Itazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Muther, and Sean Pattington. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattington. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribing matters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.